Ma'am, you have to stand up right now. That seat is for a special guest.
No, I am not standing up for her, and there's nothing anyone can do about it.
The bodyguard leaned in closer, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "Ma'am, I need you not to speak to her like that." Diane Cole opened her mouth to argue, to remind this stranger exactly whose family's tent he was standing in. And that was the moment the whole party seemed to hold its breath. Diane had planned this evening with her son Derek down to the very last detail, every part of it built to humiliate Vanessa in front of everyone who mattered. By the end of the night, Diane wouldn't have a single word left to say a word. Welcome to Mr. Justice's story. If you're new here, like, share, and subscribe, because what Diane is about to learn tonight is going to be the hardest lesson of her 50 years on this earth. Vanessa was 26 when she became a single mother. Ella's father died in a car accident 3 months before Ella was born, and Vanessa raised her alone for 4 years, 2 jobs, sometimes 3, learning to be both parents at once so well that Ella never once felt like anything was missing, even when everything was. That was the woman Derek Cole met at a friend's barbecue when Ella was 4 years old. He was charming in the way that men who have never had to work very hard for anything are charming, easy smile, easy money, a family name that opened doors before he even knocked. Vanessa was cautious. She had learned not to trust warmth that arrived without cost, but Derek was patient, or seemed to be. He played with Ella. He remembered her favorite cartoon. He told Vanessa, 6 months in, that he wanted to give her daughter a real family, a real father, the stability she'd never had. Vanessa wasn't naive. She wasn't chasing a fairy tale. She was chasing safety for Ella, for both of them, and Derek, for a while, seemed to offer it. They married when Ella was 5, and for exactly 1 year it looked, from the outside, like Vanessa had won something. From the inside, it looked different almost immediately. Derek's mother, Diane, made her feelings known in small, deniable ways from the very beginning. A comment about how Vanessa carried herself well for someone with her background. A question at Thanksgiving about whether Ella's father had been involved at all, asked in front of 6-year-old Ella like the child wasn't sitting right there. Diane never raised her voice. She never needed to. Her disapproval came dressed as concern, the way it always does when people don't want to be caught saying what they mean. And Derek's warmth had an expiration date. It expired roughly the same month the wedding pictures stopped being printed and framed. He started coming home later. He started correcting Vanessa in front of guests, small cutting remarks disguised as jokes. And then, 4 months into the marriage, he said the sentence that would define the next 3 years of Vanessa's life without her fully understanding it yet. "She's not my daughter, Vanessa. I never signed up to pay for another man's kid." He meant Ella's school fees, her clothes, her dance classes, the ones that lit her up in a way nothing else did. Derek made it clear, quietly and then not so quietly, that all of that was Vanessa's responsibility and hers alone, despite the fact that she had given up one of her jobs when they married because he told her she wouldn't need it anymore. So Vanessa went back to work. Then she picked up a second job. Then a small side project, something she built late at night after Ella was asleep, just to have a little breathing room. She was exhausted in a way that lived in her bones. She gained weight from stress and skipped meals, and the particular kind of tired that never resolves because there's no room in the schedule for rest. She stopped recognizing herself in mirrors some mornings, but Ella never went without a single thing she needed. That was the deal Vanessa made with herself, and she never broke it, even as the marriage around her kept finding new ways to break her instead. The verbal cruelty came next, and then something worse than words. Derek's temper, once hidden behind charm, showed itself fully behind closed doors, a grip on her arm too tight to be accidental, a shove during an argument that left her against a wall with her heart hammering and Ella, thankfully, asleep down the hall. Vanessa told herself it would get better. She told herself a lot of things, the way people do when leaving feels more dangerous than staying, when the whole architecture of your life is built around a child who needs stability more than she needs the truth. She stayed for Ella. She stayed because leaving felt like failing at the one thing she'd promised herself she'd never fail at: giving her daughter a full family, a full life, a father who showed up. And then, on a Tuesday evening that started like every other evening, Vanessa came home 3 hours earlier than expected because a client meeting fell through. She walked into her own bedroom in her own house and found her husband in their bed with a woman Vanessa had never seen before, young, blonde. A model Derek had met through a mutual friend, laughing at something before she noticed Vanessa standing frozen in the doorway. Derek didn't scramble. He didn't apologize. He looked almost relieved, like he'd been caught doing something he no longer had the energy to hide. Vanessa didn't scream. She turned around without another word, walked into Ella's room, packed one bag for each of them, and left that same night. She didn't fight for the house or push for a settlement. She didn't want a single thing that carried his name on it anymore. She wanted out, clean and fast, before she lost the nerve. What Derek didn't know, what he would spend the next couple of years assuming was simply untrue, was that the exhaustion Vanessa carried during their marriage hadn't been weakness. It had been the sound of a woman quietly building an exit long before she used it. The small side project she'd started in those sleepless nights, the one Derek had once glanced at and called a cute little hobby, don't quit your day job, had never actually died. It had waited. And by the time she walked into that engagement party, it was about to become the reason everyone under the tent would remember her name for the rest of their lives. If you're already feeling for Vanessa the way I did writing this, do me a favor and hit subscribe right now, because what happens to her next is going to make everything she survived worth watching unfold. Here's a question for you before we keep going. If you had spent years being told your love, your labor, and your sacrifice weren't enough, how long would you have stayed? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know. A couple of years is a long time to build a story about someone in your head, and Diane Cole had constructed an entire mythology around Vanessa's downfall without a single piece of evidence to support it. In Diane's version, Vanessa was drowning, a broke single mother twice over now. No husband, no name, no family behind her, exactly where Diane had always quietly believed she belonged. Diane repeated this story so often, at so many luncheons, that she'd stopped noticing it was fiction. She needed it to be true. It confirmed everything she'd felt since the very first barbecue where her son brought home a woman Diane considered, in her own carefully worded terms, not quite a fit for this family. So when Derek announced his engagement to Brianna, the same woman Vanessa had found him with in their bed on the night the marriage ended, the party became, for Diane, an opportunity too good to waste. Vanessa had to be invited. Excluding her entirely would have looked petty and raised questions Diane didn't want asked. But an invitation, Diane decided, could serve two purposes at once. It could look gracious, and it could deliver, in front of the entire social circle that had spent so long hearing about Vanessa's decline, undeniable proof. Diane planned the seating chart herself. Vanessa was placed at the farthest table from the head table, tucked near the kitchen entrance where the waitstaff would brush past all evening, a table Diane referred to privately as the overflow table, though there was no overflow, only design. She suggested, through a mutual friend relaying the message with false kindness, that the dress code was elegant, nothing too casual, nothing trying too hard. A comment aimed with surgical precision at a woman Diane assumed would arrive in something borrowed or last season, something that would let the room quietly compare her to Brianna, 28, radiant, dressed by a stylist Diane herself had recommended. Brianna, for her part, had spent 2 years perfecting a particular kind of cruelty, the kind delivered with a smile so warm it left people confused about whether they'd actually been insulted. She rehearsed lines about Vanessa the way actors rehearse a script, ready to deploy them the moment the opportunity arose, because being the woman who replaced someone requires, in Brianna's mind, a constant performance of superiority to keep the guilt at bay. Derek needed this evening too, though for reasons even he didn't fully examine. Some part of him needed to see Vanessa struggling, because if she was struggling, then leaving her behind had been the right call. If she was thriving, it would mean something else entirely, that the problem in that marriage had never been her. The party began under a white tent strung with warm lights, string quartet playing something classical and forgettable, champagne moving through the crowd on silver trays, and the whisper about the jet at the airfield had already made 2 full laps around the tent by the time the first course was cleared, guests trading theories in low voices. A rental, surely, or a favor from some wealthy friend, because nobody in that tent could make sense of a jet and Vanessa Cole belonging in the same sentence. Vanessa arrived alone, dressed simply, warmly, the way she always dressed, nothing showy, nothing that announced anything at all. She'd made the decision weeks earlier not to bring Ella. Whatever this evening turned out to be, it wasn't going to happen in front of her daughter. And the small cruelties began almost immediately, delivered in the practiced, deniable language Diane had built her entire relationship with Vanessa around. "You're looking well," Diane said, holding the pause just a beat too long, letting her eyes travel down and back up, considering everything. A guest, someone Vanessa vaguely remembered from a holiday years ago, leaned in with a smile stretched too wide. "You clean up so well, I almost didn't recognize you," she said, and somewhere behind her Brianna laughed, soft and musical, the kind of laugh designed to be overheard. "And where's the little one tonight?" the same guest added, glancing around as if expecting a child to materialize at Vanessa's side. "Home," Vanessa said simply, "right where she should be. Tonight isn't her party." Derek found his moment near the bar, drink in hand. That same easy smile from the barbecue years ago now curdled into something meaner. "Still trying to make something of yourself?" he asked. "How's the little hobby business going? Or did that fold too?" Vanessa didn't flinch. She didn't reach for a comeback. She simply looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable, said nothing, and turned toward her table, and something about that silence unsettled Derek more than any response could have. The evening's centerpiece, Cruelty, arrived during the toasts. Derek's best man, clearly briefed, clearly enjoying himself, raised his glass and said with a wink toward the head table, "To new beginnings and to leaving behind anything that was holding you back. Sometimes the best investment is knowing when to cut your losses." Laughter rippled through the tent, polite and knowing, and Vanessa sat with her hands folded in her lap, steady, giving the room nothing to feed on. It was the lowest point of the evening, engineered exactly as Diane had hoped, humiliation delivered with a smile so no one could be blamed for it later. But across the tent, at a table near the head of the room, a man in his 60s who no one at Vanessa's table recognized was not laughing at all. He was watching Vanessa with an expression that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with recognition. The look of someone who knows exactly who they're looking at and is quietly enjoying watching everyone else be wrong. His name was James Whitfield, though nobody at that table had any reason to know it yet. And a few feet from Vanessa, a man everyone assumed was simply her plus one, well-dressed and quiet, felt his phone buzz once in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, read a short message, and allowed himself the smallest smile, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who knows a storm is about to arrive and has already found shelter. That man was Julian Hale, and Vanessa was not walking into this party alone. She hadn't been alone in almost 2 years. If you're starting to sense there's a lot more to Vanessa than this room realizes, you're right, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Hit that subscribe button now so you're here when it happens. And I want to hear from you. Have you ever sat in a room and let people underestimate you on purpose, just to watch them find out the truth later? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. To understand what Julian Hale's small smile actually meant, you have to rewind 2 years, to the exact same week Vanessa walked out of Derek's house with nothing but one bag and her daughter beside her. She had nothing in the traditional sense. No house, no settlement, no plan beyond surviving the next month. But she had one thing Derek had never bothered to notice, because he'd never bothered to look closely at anything Vanessa built that didn't directly benefit him. Years earlier, before Derek, even before Ella's father passed, Vanessa had started something small, a modest operation selling handmade skincare products out of her kitchen, something she did on nights she couldn't sleep, something that gave her a sense of control in a life that often felt like it had none. During the marriage, she'd kept it alive in stolen hours, growing it in the margins of a life that offered her almost none. Derek had seen the boxes once, stacked in the garage, and laughed. A cute little hobby. Don't quit your day job. He never asked a single question about it again. The day she left him, that hobby had a small but loyal customer base, a modest online following, and exactly enough revenue to convince Vanessa it was worth betting everything on. So she did. She poured what little savings she had left into it. She worked nights while Ella slept, mornings before Ella woke, weekends when other mothers were at the park. She made mistakes and fixed them. She found a manufacturing partner who believed in the product before anyone else did. And 11 months after walking out of Derek's house, her company caught the attention of a man who had just lost his wife to a long illness and was looking, in the quiet, devastated months that followed, for something to pour himself into that wasn't grief. Julian Hale had built a career in consumer goods, a career built on instinct as much as strategy, and something about Vanessa's small, stubborn company reminded him of the version of himself that used to take risks before life gave him reasons to stop. He acquired the company, not to swallow it whole and strip it for parts the way so many acquisitions go, but because he saw in Vanessa exactly what he'd lost the ability to see in himself: drive that hadn't been broken by circumstance, only tested by it. What began as a business relationship became something else slowly, carefully, over the better part of a year. Julian never rushed her. He understood, without needing to be told the details, that Vanessa carried something heavy from her last relationship, something that made trust a thing to be earned in small increments rather than assumed. He showed up consistently. He remembered Ella's school recitals. He never once made Ella feel like an inconvenience attached to her mother, the way Derek had made clear, in 100 small ways, that she was. Julian simply began calling them his family quietly, without ceremony, long before anyone needed to put a label on what they were building. He gave her a stake in the company, not as a gift, but because the growth over the past year had been almost entirely her doing, and he believed people should own what they build. He arranged private travel for her, not as an extravagance, but because her work now required her in 3 cities some weeks, and he refused to let her run herself into the ground the way she had for years in a marriage that gave her nothing back. He insisted, too, on a small security detail whenever she traveled for business, a quiet precaution born from his own past experience with public deals and public scrutiny. The same detail that had leaned down to Diane's ear at the party and told her, without hesitation, that she should stand. Every piece of Vanessa's new life had been earned, and every piece of it had been offered to her by a man who had learned, through his own loss, exactly how much it costs to take love for granted. Which brings us back to that white tent, and the moment everything Diane had carefully engineered began to come apart. James Whitfield rose from his table midway through the evening and crossed the tent directly toward Vanessa, ignoring the head table entirely, ignoring Derek and Brianna, and every carefully seated guest between him and the table near the kitchen. "Ms. Cole," he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, "I have been trying to get 15 minutes on your calendar for 6 weeks. Your team keeps telling me you're too busy closing deals to take a meeting with an investor who's chasing you." A ripple of confusion moved through the tent. Diane's smile faltered for the first time all evening. Brianna's eyes darted toward Derek. James continued, oblivious or indifferent to the reaction he was causing. "The distribution numbers your company posted last quarter are the reason half the room I sit in every week is talking about you. I'd like 5 minutes before dessert if you can spare them." Derek set his glass down slowly, the ice inside it the only sound at his table for a long moment. "Your company," he repeated, like the words didn't fit together correctly in his mouth. Vanessa turned to him for the first time all evening with something other than silence. "You remember it," she said. "The hobby from the garage. I never quit." James wasn't finished. He glanced toward Derek with the mild curiosity of a man piecing together a coincidence out loud. "Cole," he said slowly, "you wouldn't happen to be the same Derek Cole who manages the regional office down in Florida, would you? Under Hale Consumer Group." He turned to Julian, who hadn't said a word yet, and gestured between the two men almost casually. "Small world. You two work for the same company." The color drained from Derek's face in a way no toast or comment from his mother had managed all night. He had spent 18 months answering to executives 2 levels removed from him, chasing quarterly targets, sitting through board memos signed by a chairman he'd never once met in person. He had never once connected the name on those memos to anything in his own life, because why would he? It had never occurred to him to ask who signed his paycheck. It had certainly never occurred to him that the answer was standing 3 feet away, holding his ex-wife's hand. Diane's damage control instincts had kept her upright through worse evenings than this one, and they carried her forward now, though her voice had lost its usual polish. "Well," she managed, "isn't that a lovely coincidence?" Then, because 2 years of resentment doesn't dissolve just because a stranger has interrupted her party, she couldn't resist one final dig, pitched low enough for only the nearest guests to catch. "Though I suppose it explains a great deal. You were always overworking yourself, weren't you? All that weight you put on, playing single mother to that girl for years. I always wondered where the energy went." The comment landed hard and stayed in the air, exposed in a way none of Diane's earlier remarks had been, because for the first time all night, she'd said the quiet part loud enough for witnesses. Julian, who'd been standing quietly a few feet away, stepped closer now, his hand finding Vanessa's, steady and certain, the way it always was when the room turned hostile. Vanessa didn't answer Diane right away. She simply held her gaze, calm and unreadable, and said only, "We'll get to that." Because James had already turned toward Derek's father, who'd arrived late and missed the earlier toasts entirely, and asked, with genuine curiosity, "Wait, you're telling me the woman who just closed the largest distribution deal in the company's history is your son's ex-wife? And she's married to the man who owns the company your son works for?" Every head at the surrounding tables turned, slowly, toward Vanessa Cole, standing near the kitchen entrance in a room built to make her feel small, while an entire party recalculated everything they thought they knew. "We are just getting started, and the confrontation coming next is the one you've been waiting for. Subscribe now so you don't miss a second of it." Quick question while we catch our breath. Do you think Diane knew exactly what she was saying when she brought up Vanessa's weight? Or do you think years of quiet resentment just slipped out? Let me know what you think in the comments below. The tent had gone strange and quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone realizes, at the same moment, that they have been telling each other the wrong story for a very long time. Diane stood frozen with her champagne glass still raised halfway, the comment about Vanessa's weight and her years of single motherhood still hanging in the air like something she couldn't take back now that it had witnesses. Derek's father, standing a few feet away, repeated his question to no one in particular, still trying to make the math add up. Brianna's hand had gone still on Derek's arm, and James Whitfield, entirely unbothered by the tension he had just detonated, simply waited, one eyebrow raised, for someone to explain what he clearly already understood. A guest near the head table, trying to smooth over the moment, turned to Vanessa with a strained smile. "Well, isn't it nice that you're still so close with the family?" she offered, gesturing vaguely between Vanessa and Diane. Vanessa didn't return the smile. "I'm not close with this family," she said plainly. "I raised my daughter alone before I ever met Derek, and I raised her alone again the moment I found out what kind of man he actually was. Tonight I'm here because I was invited, not because I owe anyone in this tent an explanation of my life. The guest's smile faltered and disappeared entirely. Vanessa straightened, smoothed the front of her coat, and turned to face the room fully for the first time that evening. She didn't raise her voice. She'd learned in the time since she left that the loudest people in any room are rarely the ones anyone actually remembers. Diane asked where the energy went, Vanessa said, and her tone was even, almost gentle, which made it land harder than shouting ever could have. I'll tell you exactly where it went. It went into working 3 jobs while I was married to your son because he decided 4 months into our marriage that my daughter wasn't his responsibility. Not her school fees, not her clothes, not her dance classes. He told me, and I remember the exact words, that he never signed up to pay for another man's kid. So I worked. I worked until I didn't recognize myself in the mirror some mornings. And you watched that happen for years, Diane, and instead of asking why I looked tired, you decided it was easier to just call me fat at your son's engagement party. The tent had gone completely silent now. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, the musicians froze in mid-phrase, unsure whether to continue. You want to know what else the energy went into, Vanessa continued, and here her eyes moved to Derek for the first time, steady and unflinching. It went into staying, long after I should have left, because I believed, wrongly, but I believed it, that my daughter needed a father more than she needed a mother who wasn't exhausted and afraid all the time. I stayed through things I've never told anyone in this tent, and I'm not going to detail them tonight, because that's not why I'm here and this isn't the room for it. But I want every person listening to understand something. I didn't leave because I got tired of being married. I left because I came home early one Tuesday and found my husband in our bed with the woman he's marrying this weekend. A sound moved through the crowd, a collective intake of breath, heads turning toward Brianna, whose composed smile had entirely disappeared. I'm not telling you this to embarrass anyone, Vanessa said, though the room understood clearly that the embarrassment was already complete, self-inflicted by a story Diane had repeated so often she'd started believing it herself. I'm telling you because Diane stood here tonight and implied that I was struggling, that I'd let myself go, that I was some cautionary tale you could all quietly pity. And I let that story exist because, frankly, I didn't owe any of you an update on my life. But since you brought it up in front of a room full of people, I think you deserve the full picture instead of the one you've been telling at your luncheons. Julian stepped forward then, not to speak for her, but simply to stand beside her, his presence a quiet statement all its own. Vanessa built the fastest-growing skincare distribution company in the region in under 2 years, he said, his voice calm, matter-of-fact, the voice of a man statting figures rather than settling scores. I had the privilege of investing in her before anyone else was smart enough to. She didn't need saving. She never has. She just needed people who could recognize what she was building instead of laughing at it. He glanced once at Derek, without malice, almost with something closer to pity. For what it's worth, Derek, you've done solid work down in Florida this past year. I've seen the reports. I just never had a reason to connect the name until tonight. Derek's face had gone through several colors during this exchange, landing finally on something pale and unsteady. He set down the glass he'd been holding for the better part of the evening and for the first time all night looked at Vanessa like he was actually seeing her. I didn't know, he said quietly, any of it, what I put you through, what I let my mother say to you tonight, what I assumed about your life because it was easier than admitting what I did to you. He glanced around the tent at the guests watching and seemed to decide he no longer cared who heard him. I'm sorry, Vanessa. I should have said that 2 years ago, not tonight, and not because a room full of people just found out who you are. I'm sorry for all of it. Vanessa looked at him for a long moment, and there was no triumph in her expression, only a kind of tired clarity. I believe you mean that, she said. But you're only saying it now because I walked in here with a jet and a company and a man who actually treats me the way I deserve to be treated the whole time. If I'd shown up broke tonight, the way your mother spent 2 years telling everyone I was, would you be apologizing right now? Or would you still be standing at that bar making jokes about my hobby business? Derek didn't answer, because there was no honest answer that didn't confirm exactly what she'd said. You never once in all this time checked on your daughter's mother to see how we were actually doing, Vanessa continued. You just assumed the worst, because the worst was easier than the alternative, that maybe leaving was the best decision I ever made. Diane, to her credit or perhaps simply out of self-preservation, had gone very quiet, the champagne glass finally lowered, her carefully constructed evening lying in ruins around her polished shoes. She opened her mouth once, as if to offer some version of an apology, and then closed it again, apparently unable to find words for a moment she had never once imagined having to navigate. James Whitfield, breaking the tension with the ease of a man who had spent decades in rooms far more hostile than this one, raised his glass slightly toward Vanessa. "For what it's worth," he said, loud enough for the whole tent to hear, "I'd take a meeting with you over anyone else at this party. Present company at the head table very much included." A few guests laughed, nervously at first, then with something closer to genuine warmth, the room's sympathy shifting so completely and so quickly that Brianna, still pale beside Derek, seemed to physically shrink under the weight of everyone's attention finally landing where it actually belonged. Vanessa felt no urge to gloat, and none was needed. She simply nodded once to Julian and said, quietly enough that only the people closest to her could hear, "I think we've said everything that needed saying. This is the moment this whole story has been building toward, and if it's hitting you the way it's hitting me, subscribe now, because the way this night ends is going to stay with you." Here's my question for you. Was Vanessa right to lay everything out in front of the whole room, or should she have taken Derek and Diane aside privately? I want to hear both sides in the comments. The party didn't end so much as it deflated, guest by guest finding quiet reasons to leave earlier than planned, the string quartet eventually resuming a song nobody was really listening to anymore. Diane retreated to a corner table with two of her oldest friends, and from a distance, Vanessa could see her talking rapidly, her hands moving in the particular way people move their hands when they're trying to explain something to themselves as much as to anyone else. Derek stood near the head table for a long time after the confrontation, not moving, not speaking, staring at nothing in particular. The way people stare when a version of themselves they'd built very carefully has just been dismantled in front of everyone they know. Vanessa didn't watch either of them for long. She had somewhere better to be. Julian found her near the edge of the tent, already reaching for her coat. "You didn't need to say all of that in there," he said gently. "You know that, right? You could have just let the numbers speak." "I know," Vanessa said, "but I needed to say it, not for them, for me. I spent years being told my worth was tied to a man who never once showed up for me, and I let that story stand for 2 years after I left because I didn't think I owed anyone an explanation. Tonight, they made me give one, so I gave them the real one instead of the one they'd already written." Across the tent, Brianna had pulled Derek aside, her voice low but sharp enough that a few nearby guests could catch fragments. Something about being humiliated in front of everyone, something about him never mentioning any of this, something about wondering out loud what else he hadn't told her. Derek had no good answers. He rarely did when the moment called for honesty instead of charm. Diane, for her part, sat very still at her corner table, her friends having grown quieter, their questions about the evenings unraveling more pointed than she had energy left to deflect. For the first time in longer than she could probably remember, Diane Cole understood, with real and uncomfortable clarity, that the story she had spent so long telling herself about Vanessa had never once been about Vanessa at all. It had been about a fear she'd never examined, dressed up as concern, worn so long it had started to feel like fact. None of them were punished in any dramatic, cinematic way. Nobody was thrown out of the tent. No security guards arrived. That's not how real consequences usually work, and Vanessa had learned over the course of rebuilding her life that the most lasting consequences are quiet ones. A fiancé who now looks at her husband-to-be with a question she can't quite shake. A mother whose grip on her son's choices has finally, permanently loosened. A man who has to live the rest of his life knowing that the woman he underestimated built something extraordinary out of the wreckage he left behind. While he built nothing at all beyond a party designed to make himself feel better, and an apology that arrived 2 years too late to mean what it once could have. As the evening wound down, Vanessa stood, smoothed her coat, and took one last look at the tent, at Diane's quiet corner, at Derek standing alone near an empty head table, at Brianna's rigid posture a few feet from him, and felt nothing that resembled triumph. What she felt was simpler than that. Relief. The particular, hard-earned relief of a woman who had spent years being told her worth was tied to a marriage, a man, a family name that never once made room for her, and who now understood, standing in her own coat with a man beside her who had never once made her feel like a burden, that she had never needed any of their approval to be exactly who she already was. Julian offered his arm, and Vanessa took it, and the two of them walked out of that tent together, past the string lights, past the quiet, stunned faces of people who had spent an entire evening trying to work out how they'd gotten this so wrong. The drive home was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm rather than precedes one. Vanessa let her head rest against the window and watched the lights of the city slide by, and for the first time all evening, she let herself feel the weight of everything she just said out loud lift off her chest, an inch at a time. The house was dark except for the porch light and a single lamp still glowing in the living room. The babysitter met her at the door with a tired smile and a quiet report, no trouble at all, fell asleep halfway through the second movie. Vanessa thanked her, saw her out, and climbed the stairs alone, still in the ivory coat, still in the earrings she'd put on hours earlier in a different life. Ella was asleep on top of her covers, one arm flung across the pillow, the television still murmuring low across the room. Vanessa turned it off, pulled the blanket up over her daughter's shoulders, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, just watching her breathe. "We're okay," she said quietly, to no one but herself, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she believed it completely. Ella stirred slightly, murmured something unintelligible, and settled back into sleep, entirely unaware of the room she just left her mother standing in, the year she just left behind her, or the fact that her mother had spent tonight, of all nights, finally saying every true thing she'd been carrying in silence for years. Vanessa leaned down, kissed her daughter's forehead, and turned off the lamp. "Here's what I think this story is really about, and I want you to sit with it for a second before you go. People will tell themselves whatever story lets them sleep at night. Derek needed to believe Vanessa was struggling, because it meant his choices didn't cost her anything. Diane needed to believe Vanessa was beneath her son, because it meant her discomfort was reasonable instead of what it actually was. But the truth doesn't wait for anyone's permission to exist. It was there the entire time, quietly building itself in the margins of Vanessa's exhausted nights, in a garage full of boxes someone once laughed at, in a little girl who grew up watching her mother refuse to quit. Being underestimated was never Vanessa's weakness. It was the one advantage nobody in that tent ever saw coming. If this story meant something to you, I want to know, have you ever been underestimated by someone who used to know you best, and then watched them realize, too late, exactly who they were dealing with? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and if you haven't already, subscribe now, because there are so many more stories like Vanessa's still to come.